It was a cold December evening in 2023 at Thornfield Manor in the Cotswolds, when James Mitchell, 38 years old, night janitor and single father to a 12-year-old daughter, entered the main drawing room for cleaning and found himself face to face with Victoria Ashworth, Britain's most ruthless billionaire, motionless in her luxury wheelchair. She looked at him with that cutting gaze that had destroyed careers and empires, expecting the usual subservience from service staff. But when James, with the naturalness of someone who had raised a disabled daughter for years, knelt before her and said simply, "I'll help you walk again," Victoria exploded in cruel laughter that filled the entire manor. "You? A simple janitor wants to help me." But when James began telling her about his daughter Emma, paralyzed from birth, and how he'd watched her take her first steps at 10 years old thanks to a miraculous mix of love, determination, and innovative therapies, Victoria stopped laughing. The tears that began falling down her face were the first she'd shed in 2 years, since the accident had condemned her to that chair. What happened in the following weeks not only challenged every social rule, but revealed that sometimes the greatest miracles come from the simplest hearts. Thornfield Manor rose majestically in the Cotswolds hills like a castle of crystal and stone, a silent witness to the power and loneliness that often travel together. It was here that Victoria Ashworth, 32 years old with a financial empire worth $3 billion, had chosen to lock herself away after the accident that had changed her life forever. 2 years earlier, Victoria had been the most feared woman in European markets. CEO of Ashworth Holdings, she had inherited a struggling company from her father at 28 and transformed it into a colossus dominating sectors from property to technology. She was ruthless in business, brilliant in strategy, and completely alone in her private life. She had no time for love, for family, for anything that didn't generate profit or power. The accident had happened during one of her usual reckless drives in her Aston Martin on the M40, a lorry that had run a red light, an impact at 80 miles per hour, and Victoria's life had shattered along with her spine. The doctors had been clear: paralysis from the waist down, no possibility of recovery. From that moment, Thornfield Manor had become a gilded prison. Victoria still ran her empire through video conferences and assistance, but had dismissed anyone who treated her with pity or understanding. She wanted efficiency, not compassion. The manor's staff changed constantly, all fired for showing even a hint of kindness towards their employer. James Mitchell had arrived at Thornfield Manor out of necessity. At 38, he had already lived enough pain to fill 3 lifetimes. His wife Sarah had died of leukemia when their daughter Emma was just 3, leaving him alone to face not only grief, but also the discovery that Emma had been born with a rare form of cerebral palsy that doctors had initially mistaken for simple developmental delay. The early years had been hell. James worked days as a factory worker and nights as a janitor to pay for Emma's therapies. There was no treatment he hadn't tried, no specialist he hadn't consulted, no sacrifice he wasn't willing to make for his daughter. The miracle had come when Emma was 10. After 7 years of innovative therapies, daily exercises, and above all unconditional love that had defied every medical prognosis, Emma had taken her first steps. They weren't perfect steps. She still needed supports. But they were real steps. Steps the doctors had said were impossible. Now Emma was 12, attended mainstream school with brilliant results, and dreamed of becoming a doctor. James had accepted the night janitor job at Thornfield Manor because the hours allowed him to be present for Emma during the day. That December evening, James was finishing cleaning when he heard a noise from the main drawing room. It was nearly midnight, and Mrs. Ashworth usually retired much earlier. Worried, he approached the door cautiously. What he saw hit him like a punch to the stomach. Victoria Ashworth sat motionless in her wheelchair before the great window, but it wasn't the physical immobility that shocked him. It was the expression on her face. For the first time since working there, James saw beyond the ice mask. He saw pain, anger, and above all, a loneliness so deep it reminded him of himself in the first months after Sarah's death. Victoria noticed his presence and turned with that cutting gaze she had learned to use as a weapon. She said nothing, but her eyes clearly communicated the message to leave. But James, who had spent years deciphering his daughter's silences when she couldn't yet communicate, recognized something different in that look. Behind the anger was a cry for help that perhaps even Victoria didn't realize she was sending. Instead of leaving, James did something completely unexpected. He approached slowly, knelt before her wheelchair, and looked into her eyes with the same gentleness he used with Emma in her most difficult moments. The words that came from his mouth cut through the air like a blade. "I'll help you walk again." Victoria's reaction was immediate and fierce. She exploded in cruel laughter that filled the drawing room and echoed off the cold marble of the manor. Her voice was loaded with sarcasm when she managed to speak through the laughter, asking how a simple janitor thought he could do what millions of pounds spent in specialist clinics hadn't managed to achieve. But James didn't move, didn't lower his gaze, didn't let himself be intimidated. He began telling her about Emma, her difficult birth, the wrong diagnoses, the doctors who had said impossible and never. He spoke of love that had defied science, of nights spent massaging legs that seemed like stone, of exercises repeated 1,000 times a day, of faith maintained when everything seemed lost. And as James spoke, something began to change in Victoria's face. The laughter died, the sarcasm vanished, and for the first time in 2 years, tears began falling down her cheeks. They were tears of anger, of frustration, but also of hope. A hope she had buried under layers of cynicism and control, but which now re-emerged thanks to the words of a simple janitor who spoke with the wisdom of someone who had transformed the impossible into reality. The next day, Victoria woke with a feeling she hadn't experienced in 2 years: curiosity. During the night, she had thought about James's words, his calm certainty, the way he had spoken of his daughter as if miracles were the most natural thing in the world. She had also done something she hadn't done for a long time. She had searched for information. Her personal assistants had worked all night gathering data on James Mitchell. What they had discovered left Victoria speechless. James wasn't just a janitor. He was a man who had dedicated the last 9 years of his life to studying every aspect of neuromotor rehabilitation. He had attended evening courses, trained online, read every available scientific publication. Not for professional ambition, but for love of a daughter, doctors had condemned to immobility. The results spoke for themselves. Emma Mitchell had become a case study at several British universities. Her ability to walk, albeit with supports, was considered a medical anomaly that had defied every prognosis. And all this thanks to a father who had refused to accept the impossible. That evening, when James arrived for his night shift, he found Victoria waiting for him in the main drawing room. She was no longer the destroyed woman of the previous night, but neither the ruthless CEO of always. She was something in between, someone struggling to decide whether to trust or not. Without preamble, she expressed her desire to meet Emma. James explained that his daughter went to school during the day, but could bring her on Saturday afternoon. Victoria's response surprised him. She wanted to see Emma in her environment, wanted to understand how he had done what he had done. She wanted to leave the manor. It was an impossible request. Victoria Ashworth hadn't left Thornfield Manor in 2 years. Everyone had tried to convince her to leave that gilded prison, but she had always refused. The outside world reminded her of everything she had lost. When James expressed doubts about her readiness, Victoria responded with a flash of her old character, reminding him that she had built an empire and could surely handle a visit, but both knew it wasn't true. Seeing Emma walk could be as devastating as it was inspiring. James made a decision that would change everything. He agreed, but with one condition. If she came to his home, she had to accept starting a rehabilitation program. Not as a patient, not as a CEO, but as a person who wanted to take back control of her life. Victoria replied that she had already tried with Europe's best physiotherapists, had done months of rehabilitation in the most expensive clinics. James interrupted her gently, explaining that she had failed because she had tried to buy a miracle instead of building one. The confrontation intensified when Victoria asked what he wanted from her. James was direct. He wanted her to believe it was possible, to stop behaving as if her life was over, to treat her body with the same respect and determination she had treated her company. Victoria's fear was palpable when she asked what would happen if it didn't work, if after weeks of attempts she remained motionless in the chair. James smiled with genuine hope, explaining that at least she would have tried, and that he would be there every night to remind her she was much more than she believed herself to be. It was an absurd promise.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Made by a man who had nothing to offer except his experience as a father and his unshakable faith in daily miracles. But in that moment, in the cold elegance of Thornfield Manor, Victoria Ashworth made the most courageous decision of her life. She accepted the challenge, warning that if it failed, if he only made her waste time and hope, she would never forgive him. James's response was simple and powerful. It wouldn't fail because he wouldn't do it. She would do it. The following Saturday, Victoria left Thornfield Manor for the first time in 2 years. The journey to James's modest flat in Birmingham was emotionally devastating. Every person walking reminded her of the freedom she'd lost. The flat was the opposite of the manor. Small, warm, full of photos of Emma and rehabilitation manuals. Emma herself was a revelation. Not the fragile child Victoria expected, but a lively 12-year-old who walked with light supports and smiled with a light that illuminated everything. Emma immediately recognized Victoria's problems and showed her exercises. She told how initially it was difficult, how they'd turned every therapy into a game, every movement into an adventure. James had taught her that her body was just learning a new language. Watching Emma move with imperfect but determined grace, something broke inside Victoria. That child was showing her courage she'd forgotten she possessed. When she asked to try, Emma made her promise never to give up. What followed was the most significant afternoon of Victoria's life. Emma taught her to awaken dead muscles. James guided with competence and gentleness. When she returned to the manor, she felt exhausted but more alive than ever. She expressed her desire to start the next day, every day, no matter how much it hurt. James smiled gently. We'll see. The following days were hell. Victoria had faced financial crises and devastating legal battles, but nothing had prepared her for the war her body was fighting against itself. James transformed a manor room into a gym, with simple but effective equipment learned during years with Emma. At 6 sharp began the battle of the day. Exercises humiliating in their simplicity, millimeter movements, contractions of apparently dead muscles. After a week of frustrations, Victoria exploded, screaming it was useless. James continued the exercises, explaining that Emma had taken 6 months to move her big toe. When Victoria tried to justify herself with age and medical diagnoses, James stopped her, reminding her of the determination that had terrorized European markets. The following weeks were small victories and great frustrations. Emma transformed weekends into moments of joy, teaching Victoria that she needed to befriend her legs, not fight against them. After 2 months came the breakthrough. During morning exercises, Victoria felt something awakening in her muscles. She called James trembling, and when she managed to contract her thigh slightly against his hands, both cried with joy. It was just the beginning, but a real beginning. For the first time in 2 years, Victoria had proof her body wasn't dead, just sleeping. 6 months later, Thornfield Manor was transformed. The cold rooms were full of life. Rehabilitation equipment, progress photos, Emma's drawings. But the biggest change was in Victoria herself. The woman who had terrorized markets had learned patience. The CEO who accepted no delays had understood that miracles follow their own timing. The billionaire, surrounded by people paid to agree, had discovered what it meant to be loved for who she was. Physical progress was slow but steady. Voluntary movements of both legs, regained sensations, upright position with supports. More important were emotional progress. She discovered she was capable of deep love for James, who'd become the partner she'd never thought she wanted, and for Emma, the daughter she'd never had. One evening, watching Emma play in the garden, Victoria confessed that initially she thought the miracle was walking again. Instead, she'd understood the real miracle was feeling alive again. She'd resumed running her company with renewed passion, founding a division for rehabilitation research. But the biggest transformation was personal. James and Emma had moved to the manor as family. When Emma asked if the real miracle was becoming a family, Victoria confirmed with tears in her eyes. The accident she'd thought was the end had been the beginning of discovering that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in hearts beating together. A year later, Thornfield Manor hosted an event nobody had ever imagined. In the main drawing room, where James had first met Victoria, motionless in her wheelchair, a wedding was being celebrated. Not a traditional wedding with hundreds of guests and lavish ceremonies, but something much more precious. The union of two souls who had found each other in the darkest moment of their lives. Victoria wore a simple white dress, seated in her wheelchair, which she no longer saw as a prison, but as part of herself. Beside her, James held Emma's hand, who had insisted on being witness to both. The celebrant was the village vicar, the same one who had baptized Emma, and who had followed their unconventional family with discretion and affection. During the exchange of vows, James reminded Victoria that he had never promised she would walk again, but that she would start living again. And looking into her eyes, he knew they had kept that promise together. Victoria replied that James had saved her not from her disabilities, but from her fears. He had taught her that love doesn't need working legs, it needs a beating heart, and her heart now beat for him and Emma. Emma, who until that moment had managed to maintain adult composure, exploded in tears of joy, shouting that now they were really a family, running to embrace both. Among the guests were some manor staff who had become family, some patients Victoria had begun following through her foundation, and even some former colleagues amazed by the transformation of the woman they had known as the Ice Queen of financial markets. But the real celebration wasn't in the wedding itself, but in what it represented. Victoria had learned that happiness doesn't depend on what the body can or cannot do, but on what the heart is willing to give and receive. James had discovered that love can take forms he had never imagined, and that a family can be born from the most unexpected moments. Emma, now 14 and increasingly confident on her legs, had become the bridge between two worlds that seemed incompatible. Her presence had taught Victoria the simple joy of small things, while showing James that love can multiply without ever diminishing. After the ceremony, while guests celebrated in the manor garden, Victoria and James found themselves alone in the drawing room where it all began. She was still in her wheelchair. He stood beside her, but there was no longer distance between them, neither physical nor emotional. Victoria observed that James had kept his promise. When he asked which promise, though he already knew the answer, she explained that he had helped her walk again, not with her legs, but with her heart. And that was the greatest miracle she could imagine. James knelt beside her, just as he had done that first evening when he had promised to help her. But now, there was no desperation in his gestures, only infinite love. He explained gently that the miracle was that they had learned love doesn't need to be perfect to be complete. Emma walked differently. Victoria moved differently. He loved differently than he had imagined. but they were perfect like this, together. That evening, while Emma slept in her new room at Thornfield Manor, and the sounds of celebration slowly faded, Victoria stayed awake, thinking about the miracle she had lived. She hadn't completely regained use of her legs. Perhaps she never would completely. But she had gained something infinitely more precious. She had learned to love without conditions, to be loved without pretenses, to find joy in small daily victories. Ashworth Holdings continued to be a successful empire, but now was guided by different principles. Victoria had created assistance programs for employees with disabilities, invested millions in medical research, transformed financial success into an instrument of social change. But in the evening, when she came home, what awaited her weren't financial reports or market strategies. James preparing dinner awaited her. Emma doing homework at the kitchen table, a family that had chosen to love each other despite, or perhaps thanks to, its imperfections. The night janitor had kept his impossible promise. He hadn't made Victoria walk in the traditional sense, but had helped her take the first steps towards a life truly worth living. And in that process, he had discovered that the greatest miracles aren't those that give us back what we've lost, but those that help us find what we didn't know we were looking for. Thornfield Manor was no longer a gilded prison of solitude. It had become a home where every day celebrated the miracle of love that overcomes every barrier, every limitation, every fear. Because sometimes, the real miracle isn't healing from our wounds, but learning to transform them into strength to love even more. If this story made you believe that love can overcome any obstacle, leave a like. Tell us in the comments, do you believe real miracles are physical or emotional? Have you ever seen someone transform a disability into strength? What does being truly rich in life mean to you? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that prove courage and love can change everything. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that every ending can be a new beginning full of hope. Remember, true disability isn't physical. It's the inability to love and be loved.